What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review of Wasteland 3. Slight caveat, normally I do this after 100%ing the game, but with Wasteland 3 there are currently 2 achievements that are bugged. You can't get them normally. You could hack the game and get them, but that obviously seems a little unfair to the premise of these review videos. I do have save files ready to go. As soon as those achievements are fixed, then I'll go back and get them. But in the meantime, I'm as close to 100% as it is literally possible to get. And because Baldur's Gate 3 Early Access is hitting next week, in like just a couple days actually, reality is I need to knock this out because that's probably going to take up a ton of my time, and I don't think I'll have time to circle back to this, frankly. Now, jumping into it, what is Wasteland 3? Wasteland 3 is a turn-based post-apocalyptic CRPG. Now, this might be where you want to compare it to Fallout, but I'm not going to do that because A, comparing games to other games is not that nice, and B, the original Wasteland actually predates the original Fallout. So there you go. Now, jumping into the first thing, we are going to go over the story first. So if you don't want any spoilers for that, I'll give you a short version, and then there's a timestamp down below to skip ahead. Or at least there should be. With that in mind, the short version is that you are from Arizona. You are part of the Rangers from Arizona, the Arizona Rangers. You are on your way to help a guy named the Patriarch who contacted the Arizona Rangers for help, and for helping, he will give Arizona the much-needed aid that it needs because Arizona is currently not a great place to live, and the Rangers are struggling to survive down there. So they send you ahead to help the Patriarch with whatever it is he needs to secure aid to send back to Arizona. And that's basically the short, spoiler-free plot synopsis. So go ahead and skip ahead if you don't want any spoilers, but for the rest of us, now we're getting into the good stuff. Like I mentioned, the Arizona Rangers are going to Colorado for aid. Colorado is ruled by a man named the Patriarch. He has managed to establish control over basically all of Colorado, and it is actually semi-civilized there. He needs help basically reining in his 3 children that have run amok. Now, on your way to Colorado, your group of 50 that were sent up there actually get ambushed, and only 3 of you survive. 2 player characters that you'll have chosen, as well as a single private from the regular. Now, once you actually make it the rest of the way and start speaking to the Patriarch, again, he reiterates that he needs help reining in his kids and gives you a base of operations and recruits to make that happen, since most of your team got wiped out by an ambush by the Dorsey Raiders, who are an enemy of the Patriarch, and as a way of apologizing for that, he tries to set you up with a base and the right, if you will, to recruit from the populace into the Rangers to help you fulfill this mission. While you are going after these 3 kids, you can choose to kill them or either arrest them and bring them back. The Patriarch makes it very clear he does not want them killed. And while you are running about the wasteland working on this, you will actually be contacted by the previous advanced squad of Arizona Rangers that were sent to make contact with the Patriarch. They start informing you, and they learned themselves, that the Patriarch is actually a pretty questionable dude, that he has made a lot of morally gray decisions, and the previous Arizona Ranger squad, the advanced team, has decided that they want him gone. They want his kids dead, they want him out of power, for all this shady, tyrannical stuff that he's been doing that you learn about throughout the story. This is an interesting part because morality plays into it a little bit, but at the same time, you have to understand this is a post-apocalyptic world, so modern-day morality doesn't exactly factor into it. But you learn all sorts of crazy stuff, like, say, how he is sending prisoners to a gang called the Godfishers, who are then killing these people as ritual sacrifices to their gods. And the Patriarch is doing that to make sure that the Godfishers don't continue to attack, but at the same time, the Patriarch isn't just sending random citizens to this, he's sending people who are already sentenced to die. As in Colorado, most crimes are punished by time in what they call the pillories, where basically your clothes are taken off, you're stripped down to your underwear, and you're chained to a pillory. But in Colorado, which is perpetual nuclear winter basically, it's basically a death sentence because it's so cold the frostbite is going to kill you. You might get lucky and only have a short time in the pillories, but you're still basically guaranteed frostbite and limb damage permanently. So it's not like these people weren't already going to die that he's sending to the Godfishers. He's just basically doing that. And while that's a terrible thing to do, because either way you're going to die, but arguably sending people off to go get ritually sacrificed as opposed to carrying out the agreed upon civilization government form of justice, which is the pillories, it's just like either way, it's terrible, right? But again, post-apocalyptic wise, in order to keep the Godfishers from attacking, he's sending these people who are basically already sentenced to death anyway. So again, some moral debate there about whether that's right or wrong. Given the context, obviously in the modern day, it's 100% terrible 6 ways to Sunday. But eventually you're either going to kill all of his kids, maybe reel them in, maybe kill some of them, arrest the other half. And then you're going to come up to the endings. Now, I'm not going to spoil any of them per se, but I will say there's a variety of endings. And by that, I mean there's basically 3 endings that all have some nuance to them. So you'll get endings for each area you visit, each major character really, as well as how the story actually wraps up. Did you choose to side with the advanced team and take out the Patriarch? Did you stay true to what the Patriarch wanted? So he agreed to send aid to Arizona. Does Arizona not get that aid that it needed? All sorts of things. So like I said, variety of endings. There is what I would consider probably the best ending that is a little tricky to get. By the way, again, spoiler alert, skip ahead if you don't want to hear it. There is a good ending in which you can essentially turn the factions that work for the Patriarch against him, basically peacefully usurp power from the Patriarch and choose to take over Colorado for yourself, at which point you become the de facto leader as the Rangers. And you're able to, again, either choose to send aid to Arizona or maybe become a tyrant yourself. But if you choose to send the aid to Arizona and rule Colorado, the Rangers basically peacefully take over Colorado as an occupying force. That's probably the best ending and resolves the best things for everyone all around. So that's like the one true good ending. There you go, just kind of a general sum up of the story. I personally enjoyed it quite a bit. I thought it was good. The characters were very well written, so it was a good time. But moving on to the combat. As I mentioned, it is turn-based. Turn-based seems to be a touchy subject for people for some reason. I don't understand that personally. I think if you're watching my channel, you probably enjoy it. I go over a lot of turn-based stuff, but it's not lost on me that some people absolutely hate turn-based combat. But I'm here to tell you, as far as turn-based combat goes, I think Wasteland 3's is very good. They had a lot of features and things that really kind of help the combat move itself along while not becoming mired in the slowness and things like that are often accompanied with these turn-based games, period. Personally, and I know I'm going to sound like a douchebag just saying this out loud, I did not find this game difficult. Even on its hardest difficulty level, it was not much of a challenge. So that incredibly pompous statement out of the way. As I've mentioned for several turn-based games, it just boils down to action economy. The only real difficult thing about the hardest difficulty of this game is that most of your characters will die in 1 to 2 hits, regardless of how you build them, regardless of what they're in. Reality is, in the highest difficulty, most members of your team die in 1 to 2 hits from just about anyone. And because of that, you need to focus all of your efforts on managing the action economy, which is basically making sure the enemy can take as few actions as possible through a variety of means. And personally, because I do that so often with all of these games that I play, it just was not particularly difficult. However, I have read a lot of reviews and things like that on Steam from people who are just not having a good time with the highest difficulty, so I realize that's not everybody. It's a little contentious. Personally, I didn't find it difficult, but there you go. Now, some of the features that I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk about are the combat lets you turn friendly fire on or off regardless of the difficulty. It lets you automatically set up to reload your weapons after combat or choose to do it manually, stuff like that. The entire team of your friendly team versus your enemy team and then your friendly non-player characters will all take turns as a team. So what that means is your player-controlled and companion characters will take their turn, and then the entire enemy team will take their turn, and then your friendly non-player character will take their turn, and then it kind of just goes by that, but it's the entire team. So if it's your turn's team, you'll get to move and attack with every single one of your characters before it becomes the enemy team's turn. I also want to highlight the ambush, prepare, and defend skills. These are skills that every character gets, And basically ambush lets you, instead of moving and attacking, ambush lets you set up an ambush. So if an enemy walks into the range of a character who is ready to ambush, they will just automatically be attacked for normal AP cost or whatever, instead of actually attacking on your turn. You can wait for the enemy to instead move into that person's attack range, which will then trigger the ambush, and then they'll get attacked. There's also the prepare ability, which costs 1 AP and lets you carry over AP you didn't use if you didn't need it. But like say you had 2 or 3 AP and it wasn't enough to attack, you can then carry extra AP over to your next turn with the prepare ability. And then there is defend. So if you didn't find cover, which I'll get into in a second, and your character is standing out in the open, you can use extra AP to trigger the defend skill, which for every point of AP gives you extra defensive bonuses while the enemy is taking their turn, which essentially leads to no wasted AP. The other part of combat I want to talk about is its implementation of cover. There are 2 types of cover. There's half cover and full cover. And basically what this does is standing behind it greatly reduces your enemy's chance to actually hit you with their attacks, like percentage-wise. So if you're standing out in the open, your enemy has a 95% chance to hit you, which seems to be the cap in general. But if you're behind cover, that starts to get reduced by the positioning of the enemy, as well as whether or not they destroy the cover outright, because that's also possible. All of this leads to a large variety of builds, and you can mix and match skills and stuff to make combat a really fun time. With that in mind, let's talk about some of those builds and the role-playing system that Wasteland 3 uses. So, you can pick a background and a quirk, which kind of lets you build the fantasy of your character if you didn't want to make a background outright. Backgrounds will give you bonuses, quirks will give you a bonus and also a drawback. So, for instance, Serial Killer, which is a personal favorite of mine, will give you 3 extra AP if you kill an enemy that turn, but across the board, you lose 1 AP just normally. From there, we have just tons of skills to use. Almost all of them are represented very well. There are skill checks for basically every single skill, and they come up quite often. The only skill I don't think really gets much attention in that regard is the barter skill, which only has like 1 or 2 checks that I noticed, and just, other than selling stuff for a lot, wasn't that great. But with that in mind, tons of skills. So there's nerd stuff, which will let you hack robots in combat as well as hack terminals and things just out in the world. There is stuff like weapon modding, armor modding, all sorts of different weapons, like say heavy weapons, small guns, brawling weapons, which is like fist weapons, melee weapons, which is like hammers and swords and stuff like that, as well as assault weapons, that kind of stuff. So combining those weapon abilities with the more situational stuff, like again, nerd stuff letting you hack robots mid-combat, or say Animal Whisperer letting you tame hostile creatures during combat, in addition to having an animal companion, really just leads to there being quite a bit of variety for a CRPG like this. I had a lot of fun with the combat and interacting with those skills in a fun way. Personally, mechanics was actually a favorite skill, which I didn't see coming. I didn't think about it much at the beginning, but mechanics will let you deploy robots on your side of the team for the combat, like for that particular combat session, so they just kind of die once you leave combat. They just explode. But you can use mechanics to summon these deployable robots, and then you can also use mechanics to like turn off generators to turrets, which will destroy them. So just a lot of variety to the combat, and it was really fun, so I wanted to mention it kind of in detail there. Now let's talk about the world of Wasteland 3. As far as post-apocalypses go, it's very full of life. Things are often changing, like as you interact with the world and complete quests and go back to areas, like stuff's constantly moving around. The world feels alive, and they did a really good job of nailing that. In fact, Colorado Springs and places like the Bazaar really kind of drive home this push back to civilization. Like people are gathering up, like cities are being built even, not in the traditional sense, but like towns and stuff. Cities might be a bit of a stretch in terms of like population size. But basically, society is pushing back to just that, society and a civilized living. And you can kind of see that grading up against all these tribes and things that had popped up in the wake of the post-apocalypse. Which, by the way, for the sake of, since we're talking about the world anyway, in explaining that, apparently in Wasteland's world, a meteor of some sort hit a U.S. defense satellite array, which inadvertently triggered a nuclear attack, which then was, of course, responded to. And basically, the entire world was destroyed on a fluke because an asteroid hit a satellite. Another thing that I think really helps the world building is these cutscene conversations with important characters. So when you meet important characters or important story conversations, like they'll get a 3D close-up version of that conversation, which you should be able to see on screen right now. And surprisingly, it really, really immerses you into the game. Like, holy crap, I didn't think much of this feature when they talked about it, but actually playing with it in mind and like seeing it firsthand and experiencing that as I played the game, I really love these conversations, and this is something I hope CRPGs in general, and maybe even video games in general, to be honest, start incorporating more of, because I loved this feature like way more than I thought I was going to. It surprised even me how much I turned out to really enjoy that. So again, overall, the world is surprisingly in-depth, really drives home the post-apocalypse. There's all these factions warring with each other and these interactions. Like, they did a fantastic job on the world building in this game. That brings us to the factions. So, there are two factions directly under the Patriarch's control that you could consider friendly, if you will. There are the Marshals and the 100 Families. The Marshals are basically the cops of Colorado. They are kind of like the army, basically. They keep the peace in Colorado for the Patriarch. Sometimes that's not always a great thing because they have a position of power and they are known to abuse it. So there is some nuance between the fact that some of the Marshals are factually abusing their power. And then there's the 100 Families. The 100 Families are essentially the nobles of Colorado and also housed in Colorado Springs, which is like the main city, by the way. The 100 Families are literally the 100 families that helped the Patriarch take Colorado from the Monster Army. The Monster Army is the old rulers of Colorado. They are basically people who decided that if they put on these monster masks and stuff, they could be anyone they wanted. Which sounds weird, and it comes off weird in-game a little bit, to be honest, but it's like post-apocalypse, so, you know, it strangely fits with everything else going on. But basically, they put on these masks and stuff, and they look like werewolves and things like that. Like, not literally, they're humanoid, but you can tell they have a mask on. But basically, the idea is that the mask makes them whoever they want to be, and, you know, that scares people. And that's apparently how they ruled Colorado for a while, until the Patriarch and the 100 Families basically beat them back. Now the Monster Army essentially controls one tiny part of the Colorado area known as the Bazaar, which is an old mall, and they've essentially become like high-profile merchants. So good for them for adapting, I suppose. Then we have the Gippers, who are interesting. So the Gippers worship Ronald Reagan as a god. They call him the God President. They worship a Ronald Reagan AI that was somehow made. And they're kind of nut jobs, to be honest. But they are well armed, and they're the only people in Colorado who know how to refine oil. So if you want to drive a car, if you want power on in your cities, the Gippers kind of need to be dealt with in some way. Which comes up because the Gippers are actually housing one of the Patriarch's kids, so you have to deal with the Gippers to resolve the story. And, you know, as you might imagine, again, there's only people who can refine oil, so how you deal with them is very important to the endings of the game. Now, unfortunately, those are the main factions you'll be interacting with from like a reputation system standpoint. However, there are other factions I wanted to mention. There are the gangs of Colorado, which are the Scar Collectors, who are like cyborgs who take slaves and stuff and sell them. They operate the slave trade, basically. There are the God Fishers, which I mentioned previously. They are religious people who think that mutilating corpses and tying them to kites will appease the gods and end this awful stuff going on around them, which is obviously nut job talk, but again, that's their whole thing. And then they have the Payasos. The Payasos like to dress up like clowns because they think the post-apocalypse was part of some, as they call it, the great joke. There is like a weirdly religious aspect to the Payasos where they think that God, or Jesus or whoever, brought on the apocalypse as the great joke, that they gave people life and then he took it away to get a laugh out of it. And so the Payasos dress up like clowns and torture and do all sorts of terrible things to people as a joke. They find it funny. It's very disturbing, to be honest. When it comes to the gangs, I do want to mention that it is hinted at that you might have been able to join them, like in certain conversations. It seems like it would make more sense if you could have, like, an option to join them or something might have come up. which makes me feel like that at some point maybe they were considering that as an option and that's just like remnants of it, so to speak. But there is no option to join the gangs. That's kind of my extended take on Wasteland 3, just some opinions and things right there. So real quick before I wrap it up, I do want to mention some things that I did not enjoy in this game. The content of Wasteland 3 is very front-loaded. Now this is not uncommon in video games. Factually, most people don't finish video games. You might think that's an exaggeration, but it's not. More often than not, maybe 40% of people who play video games will actually finish a video game to the end. So with that in mind, content at the beginning of the game tends to be very front-loaded. And with Wasteland 3, that is very prevalent. So the big two towns, I would say, are Colorado Springs and the Bazaar. Colorado Springs is, of course, the main capital of like the Patriarch's territory, and the Bazaar is held by the Monster Army. Probably 70% of the game's side missions and stuff are from those two areas. And then after you get that done, it just drops off like a rock. So not a big fan of that. There, again, is also no option to join the gangs. Essentially, you're there to deal with Colorado, right? You can choose to help the Patriarch. You can choose to depose him, as we talked about. But here's the thing. There's all these gangs out here. One of the Patriarch's kids is actively trying to gather them up. One of your companions, potentially, Iron Cordrite, is also trying to gather them up as an army. Why can I not choose to side with these gangs and then destroy? Like, I realize that would be like in stark contrast to the Ranger life, but you know, at the same time, you go to Colorado, you get ambushed and almost wiped out. I can't just like roleplay that harrowing event left me a little scarred PTSD-wise, and I go off, join one of these gangs, and choose to destroy the Patriarch anyway as some sort of grand joke, even, to get back at the Patriarch for doing all of this. I just hate that joining those gangs is not an option. It drives me nuts. One last con is that all of the actual companions are a bit dull. So the way Wasteland 3 works is you can actually create custom characters to fill out most of your party. You only have to take up to 2 custom characters, companions rather, with you. You can have up to 4 custom created characters and up to 2 companions to take with you. You can have more than the 2 companions, but you have to have at least 2. That wouldn't bother me as much, but like, man, the companions in this game are kind of lackluster. Like, none of them are that interesting, to be honest. In a world full of characters that they've managed to develop, and somehow none of these companions manage to be interesting, and it just bothers me. Like, all of them are boring. There's Persepi, which is like a scientist. You meet her so late in the game, you barely get to use her. Iron Cordite is clearly somebody any morally good person would want to kill because he's actually the ex-leader of the Scar Collectors. You have Fish Lips, which is just like your standard tough guy who is the most boring dude in the world. You have Lucia Wesson, which is a daughter of one of the 100 families. She's a little interesting, and she is literally the only companion that gets any kind of story arc. Literally all of the rest of them just follow you around and make comments. That's it. There's no like quest for them or anything. Lucia is the exception to that. Marshal Quan is an ex-marshal, so he's super boring, has very little to say. He's supposed to be like your slick, charismatic guy, but fails to do that in every way. Then you have Private Jody Bell, which is outside of your player characters, the only survivor of the ambush at the beginning of the game. She's actually pretty cool. She's got a lot of character to her. I like her as a person, but again, there's no character development. She's just kind of there if you want her to be. I will say that while she is not a particularly interesting person, she is somehow managed to be still the most lively companion you get, and I appreciate her for that, if nothing else. There you go, guys. Wasteland 3, some of my thoughts on the systems, how things like that work, my thoughts on the story, that stuff. And at the end there, some cons about things I didn't like about the game. If you liked this review after 100%, please like, comment, subscribe. I'm really trying to grow this channel. Things have been going incredibly well lately, so thank everyone for that, especially if you managed to watch until the very end of this video. Kudos to you. Now, thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.